This is the story about Dennis Nilsen, how a seemingly intelligent man, a cliched accountant, former soldier, and ex-cop had a ritual of murdering and then living with the dead. This case did not only astonish Britain but the whole world. On February 8, 1983, a plumber had been called to Muswell Hill, North London. The residents of the flats in the property, 23 Cranley Gardens, had been continuously complaining to the landlord about blockages in their drains. Many residents noticed strange malodor from their drains, the same odor of a dead rotten animal. Michael Catran was assigned to do this task. He removed the manhole cover outside the property to check the drains, and immediately he was repulsed by the stench. Being determined to find out, he dug his hands into the drain and pulled out the waste. He was disgusted as what he extracted looked like flesh and small pieces of bone. Two of the house's occupants come outside and talk to Michael. One of them remarks, "It looks to me like someone has been flushing down their Kentucky Fried Chicken." He was none other than Dennis Nilsen, the occupant of flat 23D. Dennis Andrew Nilsen, also known as Des, was born on November 25, 1945, in a fishing town called Fraserburgh in Aberdeenshire, Scotland. His father was a Norwegian. He arrived in Scotland where he met Dennis's mother. As is often the case with serial killers, they have a sad childhood, so was the case for young Dennis. The three children of the marriage were all conceived only when the itinerant soldier decided to visit home. There was no love, just instinct driven by a soldier's loneliness. Unsurprisingly, their marriage didn't last long. The only person that Nilsen adored was his grandfather. Nilsen and his grandfather had a great bond. He took him on walks through the sand dunes as the waves of the North Sea clashed on the shore. He really loved his grandfather, but one day when aged 62, grandfather went out fishing, he had a sudden heart attack and died. Ever since then, Nilsen was always plagued by sorrow, often saying his life is empty until his grandfather returned. Because of this, he always had this constant need for someone who would never leave, always be there to love, which made him a monster. In his teenage years, Nilsen realized he was homosexual, but he could not share this with others. He felt confused and ashamed, not only because of his sexuality but because he was attracted to boys who looked similar to his siblings. To explore his feelings, he touched his brother while he's sleeping. Suddenly his brother woke up. On realizing what he was doing, he humiliated Dennis every time by calling him a sissy. In public, the brother called him hen, a Scottish term for a girl. It was extremely saddening that he was not accepted. Dennis felt that he could not live in that orthodox town. At age 16, moved to England to train with the Army Catering Corps. He really enjoyed it there, but always had to keep his attraction for fellow soldiers a secret. He wanted a man, but he knew what would happen if he came out in the army. People were homophobic in the early 1960s. Nilsen was stuck with his fantasies, ones that consisted of a passive lover, a man completely subdued to his will. The best choice was a still unconscious man. He was then stationed in the Middle East, where for the first time soldiers in his regiment died. He was even kidnapped by an Arab taxi driver at one point and almost died himself. He got away, but the darkness that had always enveloped him grew more intense. He'd seen death, he'd almost died, and now his fantasies were driven by death. They often included intimacy with dead soldiers. It was only a matter of time until fantasy would manifest as fact. In the early 70s, Nilsen moved to London and joined the police force. Finally, he had the opportunity, so he started going to gay pubs and had short-term relationships with other men. But that was not the end of his satisfaction. He always remembered the loss of his grandfather. He hated casual dating. He wanted the men to stay with him forever. He later became a junior constable in the police force and eventually rose to the position of supervisor at a job center in Kentish Town. He was a likable, hard-working officer. But somewhere during all his success, he'd started murdering the men he never wanted to leave him. November 1975. There's a fight outside a pub, quite common in the streets of England. Nilsen helps a 20-year-old guy out. After a few drinks and talks, he discovers he is gay like him. Soon, they were in a relationship. Things were going well. They lived in a house on Melrose Avenue, 195. Later, Nilsen's first place of crimes. Everything was going well. They spent time with each other cleaning the house and doing dishes, just like a perfect couple. But as time went on, things changed. Fights and domestic abuse were the case. By 1977, the two had gone their separate ways. He met men, but they had no intention of staying with Nilsen. In 1978, Nilsen was quite lonely and distraught. He used to work hard during the day and drink heavily at night. One day he met his first victim, a teenager who'd been trying to buy booze without much success. Nilsen was out that night and hit his jackpot. The boy discovered someone to purchase him the alcohol. Following an intense session on their procurement, Nilsen awoke to find the slumbering boy beside him. He didn't want him to depart, he couldn't let him go. In his mind, he declared, "You will stay with me over the new year, whether you like it or not." Nilsen retrieved a tie from the drawer and strolled calmly over to the sleeping boy. On reaching the boy, he strangled him and then submerged him in a bathtub full of water. Afterward, he bathed and caressed the body. Now the boy belonged to him and he could do as he pleased. The remains lingered under the floorboards for months until they started to ooze in pus and maggots. Nilsen incinerated them in the once beautiful garden. After a couple of months, just a few months later, the police supervisor felt the need for another partner that wouldn't leave him. This time he met a young man in London from Hong Kong. Again, after the victim was plied with potent alcohol, Nilsen took out his tie. This time he failed and the man ran away. The victim reported to the authorities but then chose not to pursue the matter. Did the police investigate? They perceived a well-spoken man who had a rendezvous with a stranger that had escalated. Maybe that's customary in that community, they pondered. If only they had monitored Nilsen, because shortly after, he met a young Canadian visiting England. Nilsen proposed to show him the sights, but first, how about some strong drinks? Why not, said the Canadian. After many fun shots of rum and whiskey, Nilsen was enjoying listening to music as he knew that the victim would be forever his. The Canadian, feeling rather wasted, had his back turned to him. Nilsen crept across the room and strangled the man with the headphone cord. For the next week, during his boozy nights, he sat next to the dead body. He placed it upright in an armchair to make it seem like the body was still alive. Together they watched TV. Nilsen laughed out loud at the comedies he liked, occasionally turning to his partner, the corpse, and remaking how funny the show was. The relationship ended when bloating and putrefaction started. The body went under the floorboards, but now Nilsen was single again, the great problem of his life. There were more victims, more housemates, more companions, call them what you will. Each of them watched TV with Nilsen, listened to music, and shared his bed. He conversed with them while cooking and asked their opinion about the weather. However, all of them decomposed and ultimately left him. Despite Nilsen committing these reprehensible acts, some part of him recognized it was wrong. Sometimes he spat at his reflection after a murder, occasionally breaking down in tears, but it didn't deter him. The bodies he hadn't incinerated accumulated under the floorboards. Regardless of how much deodorant he used, he couldn't mask the odor of decaying flesh. One by one, he retrieved them, each infested with maggots, emitting decomposition fluids. They were no longer the partners he desired. He chopped them and incinerated the evidence in the garden, concealing the scent of burning flesh with discarded car tires. Kids from the neighborhood came around, excited that some man had made a bonfire. Who knew that it was only Nilsen that knew, as they were dancing around a great pyre of his former lovers. When the fire turned down, all that was left were the ashes. He then took out the bone fragments and smashed the bits of skull. Nilsen was feeling the guilt, so he stopped killing for a while, but couldn't fight back those fantasies of his. Almost a year later, he was doing it again. Why? Why is he doing that? He once said something, maybe you could answer this. I could only relate to a dead image of the person I could love. The image of my dead grandfather would be the model of him at his most striking in my mind. He couldn't stop. He went on his killing spree. Killed many times. Nilsen also killed a man whom he had helped by taking him to the hospital after he overdosed on epilepsy medication. When the guy came back from hospital to thank Nilsen for saving life, that was the end of him. This was his life. He even admitted it later, saying at times his days consisted of end of the day, end of the drink, end of a person, floorboards back, carpet replaced, and back to work. He had to take a lot of sick leaves so that he could get time. Dissecting bodies and burning them was time-consuming, and anyway, when the bodies were still fresh, he wanted to spend as much time with them as he could. The shock came when Nilsen's landlord asked him to vacate the premises for renovations. 5 more bodies were under the floorboards, and he had to call in sick again. He incinerated the bodies and received compensation from the landlord. He relocated to 23 Cranley Gardens, a 1930s semi-detached with Tudor-style exposed wood on the facade. A dream house for some, a nightmare for others, and inconvenient for a serial killer without a garden. Nilsen still invited young men to his attic flat, but knowing disposal would be challenging, he refrained from killing them, even when heavily intoxicated. One day, in March 1982, one young man got so drunk that Nilsen couldn't awaken him. He almost controlled himself from killing him, but he snapped, strangling the man with a strap. The victim fought back, almost killing Nilsen. The struggle resulted in the man's demise, and Nilsen emitted a sigh of relief. He disposed of the body and faked a story about neck bruises at work. The next victim altered everything. Just 2 months later, Nilsen encountered a 21-year-old in a drag cabaret bar in Camden Town. They drank together, and Nilsen lured him to his house. The man awoke partially confined in a sleeping bag, and Nilsen strangled him. Thinking he was finished, Nilsen placed him in an armchair to watch TV together. His dog, Bleep, joined in the macabre scene. Sensing life in the body, Nilsen refrained from finishing him off and tried to revive him. The man eventually woke up, and Nilsen spun a tale of a near self-strangulation and how he helped him by keeping him in a sleeping bag and a cold water bath to revive him. Nilsen hoped that they would meet again in future, and he let him go to the nearest hospital. Nilsen just let him leave, and he went off to the nearest hospital. They would, but not quite as Nilsen imagined. On October 9, 1982, Nilsen called in sick to deal with another killing. This time, finding places to hide the body parts proved challenging. A few months later, he met 20-year-old Stephen. After indulging in drinks and music, Nilsen leaned in and uttered, "Oh Stephen, here I go again." Nilsen almost felt sorry for this victim, observing bandages on his wrists. With 3 dissected bodies in his small flat, he disposed of organs and smaller body parts like flesh and bone in the toilet, and other chunks were boiled to separate the flesh. Unsatisfied, he complained about blocked drains to the landlord and faced increasing scrutiny from neighbors. And now we come back to the scene where that plumber suspected he hadn't found remnants of Kentucky Fried Chicken. When he returned to the house the next day with his boss, they both were suspicious about the sludge. They were sure that one thing they found in the drain was a human eye. It was discovered by the pathologist that the flesh was of humans. When the police awaited Nilsen's home, they asked if they could look inside his flat. He didn't say no. It took about 3 seconds after entering the flat to notice the awful stench of human decomposition. That's a smell you never forget. When the cops told him that they'd found human flesh in the drains, Nilsen pretended to be shocked, acting like someone else had put the flesh there. This lasted about 2 minutes because he knew he was finished. When the cops asked where the rest of the bodies were, he pointed them to a wardrobe. Before they even opened it, they didn't really need to due to the stench. They asked him if there was more. Nilsen replied, "It's a long story. It goes back a long time. I'll tell you everything. I want to get it off my chest." In handcuffs, he was put into the back seat of a police car. One of the officers asked him if the remains belonged to 1 or 2 people. Seemingly calm, Nilsen answered, 15 or 16, since 1978. Sometime later, investigators found in his flat hands a skull, a severed head, a torso, arms, organs, and other body parts. During the many hours of interrogations, he was even asked why he did so, to which he responded, "I'm hoping you will tell me that." He said, "At another point, I wished I could stop, but I couldn't. I had no other thrill or happiness." During the trial, he tried to prove that he was not that guilty, his argument being that when killing people he thought he was doing the right thing. But then the ones who'd got away came forward as witnesses, proving that Nilsen was in control all the time and knew exactly what he was doing. The jurors seemed in a state of utter shock as they heard about how he made the bodies of his lovers as if they were alive. They were disgusted as they listened to how he dissected the bodies. Nilsen stood in the dock looking like he'd done nothing wrong in the slightest. On November 3, 1983, he received a life sentence with a minimum of 25 years. In 1994, the British Home Secretary determined that Nilsen would never be released. He spent the rest of his life in isolation in prison, writing memoirs that delved into his motives and actions, which were put together from over 6,000 confessional notes. In those memoirs, he explains why he committed those crimes, one time writing, "I caused dreams which caused death. This is my crime." In 2018, at the age of 72, Nilsen succumbed to a pulmonary embolism and internal bleeding. No family members were present during the cremation. Years later, his flat was renovated and up for sale. Several years later, his flat was renovated and up for sale at a good price because of the affluent London suburb. But interested people were always warned about the flat as it has a dark history. The ad for the flat contained a warning saying buyers are kindly asked to research the history of this property or inquire with the marketing agent before viewings. For more videos like this, subscribe to the channel and hit the bell icon for notifications. Bye for now.